Thank you for joining us for today's session. I'm your host, Debbie Mathias with the BUILD Initiative. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement from Giovanna Archuleta, Assistant Secretary for the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department.
I would like to open up this meeting acknowledging our Mother Earth and the land she nurtures us with, the land where our children grow, and the land that provides the food to feed them. When we talk about these resources, we must also acknowledge the lands of our tribal people and the deep spiritual and long-standing relationship of all tribal nations. Today I come from Nambe, the land of my ancestors who cared for it and fought for it so that I may one day live and raise my own children on it. A relationship that predates colonial contact by thousands of years. Our ancestors still speak to us and guide us through our songs, ceremonies, and writings. Through removal, trail of tears, long walks, assimilation, and the idea that by removing children would kill a culture. Our ancestors did not give up. Our tribal people are some of the most resilient people in our country, continuing to raise children to be resilient, who are nurtured through language and culture, the language and culture that cannot be removed. We must also acknowledge all other spirits who were forcefully displaced from their homelands and trafficked for labor and production on sacred native land. All of us collectively continue to experience the adversity that caused our ancestors and spirits who continue to hurt from actions done to them. Take a moment to pray these people find the healing and peace to raise their children in a world that has so many opportunities, but most importantly, create coexistence free of violence. Tribal people are praying people. This is where we are all tied. Our grandmothers and mothers continue to pray over us. And as tribal people pray, they pray for people in the north, in the east, in the south, and the west. They pray for infants, children, adults, and elders, and our non-human relations, each with knowledge to share with us. As this conference begins, I hope that each of you are balanced in all directions and take a moment to appreciate what Mother Earth has given to us and how she continues to nurture us in many ways. I invite and encourage you to learn who are the original stewards of the land you live and work on and support those nations and children of those lands. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna, especially important for this particular session today. The BUILD team is excited to present this 20 webinars in 20 days for QRIS 2020 as we explore ideas, possibilities, and learn together about how we might recreate better, more equitable systems with children, families, and early childhood professionals at the center of our efforts. We're grateful to the many individuals who took time to prepare sessions, generate content, and ideas to share. We believe the sessions will inspire you to build on these ideas, continue conversations, and innovate back in your own communities and states. Boy, we've learned a great deal as we prepared for a virtual event. One of our lessons is that a virtual event draws a much broader audience than an in-person conference does. The BUILD QRIS conference was designed for early childhood system leaders at the national, state, territory, tribal, nation, and community levels. As registration rolled in for the virtual event, we discovered many direct service providers, from teachers to center directors and home-based providers signing up for the session. We welcome you to our learning community and look forward to hearing your perspective. We encourage you to share your comments, ideas, and questions in the chat box. As you know, we had to pivot from our in-person conference to a virtual conference. We'd like to say a very sincere thank you to our sponsors who made that switch possible. Their support is essential to this event. Well, now for a little Zoom tutorial. We've all become familiar with the Zoom platform over the past few months as we've used it to connect with friends, family, community, and colleagues. We want to point out a few specific features that may be new to you. First, you can choose your view. In the upper right-hand corner, click either on the speaker view to see the active speaker, or you can choose the gallery view to see everybody and be able to scroll through and see who's here. Next, we encourage you to provide feedback throughout the session by first clicking on the participant icon to open the participant list, and then looking down at the bottom, and there are icons along the bottom. Let's have everybody click on one. Yes, no, go slower, go fast, more. Everybody try it once. Get some things out there. And then next, we want to make sure you chat with us. We encourage you to be active participants in the session. Please share your ideas, experiences, and questions in the chat box. If there are polls in this session, a box will pop up on your screen, and we encourage you to respond. This helps us generate more conversation and enhances our learning together. Now it's with pleasure that I turn it over to Camille Catlett to introduce our session leaders and launch our session.
Hi, everyone. It's delightful to see the names, the faces, and the avatars of friends and colleagues from throughout the country. I am pleased to be with you today and with two very talented and delightful colleagues you will soon be meeting. I'm actually going to ask each of them to please say hello so you can become familiar with their face and their name. Cathy and Marye, if you would please introduce yourselves.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Cathy Collie-Robinson. I'm the program director for the Early Childhood Program at Durham Tech, and I'm very excited to be with you all today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vance. I'm also a professor at Durham Technical Community College, Early Childhood Program. I'm so glad to be here today.
Thank you both. And you'll notice as a fourth picture, our dear colleague, Flo Thompson, is with family and could not physically be present, but part of what we want to make sure we do is to credit the many ideas she has provided. We'll be sharing resources that she created as part of this session and really feel that she deserves full recognition for the role that she has played. Let me also share a little bit about how Cathy, Marye, and I are connected. We're working together as part of a project that's called Script NC, because this high quality early childhood program at Durham Technical Community College, and I say high quality, this is a nationally accredited program, but these colleagues raised their hand to say, we are willing to do more work because we would like to make sure that our program is even more explicit and more intentional in the way that we build a consistent emphasis on inclusion, diversity, and equity. And part of what you will learn more about is how they have done that. The next slide heralds a really thoughtful thing that our colleagues at Build and QRIS have done. Prior to this session, they asked all of you to identify the topics and the information you were most interested in. You provided this information, we listened. They sent that information to us, and based on your priorities, part of what we did was to revise some of the content, some of the examples, and the way in which we have structured this session. So please know that we listened. A priority that you mentioned again and again and again was that you wanted access to resources. And what you'll see on the next slide is one of the ways in which we have responded to that request. So there is a handout for this session, and hopefully you have downloaded that handout. We believe that you will have a much more enjoyable time with us if you have the handout in front of you. But in addition to the handout, one of the things that we have done is to create a website at which we have posted lots and lots of free resources. So when we talk about the preschool personas, those are posted for you at this website. When we talk about the new collection of race and racism resources, those are posted for you at this website. We'll refer throughout this session to this as your website, and just some of you may notice that this same website is at the bottom of the handout for this session. I've also just posted it in the chat box. So please know that all of the things that we will be sharing, including the handout, the PowerPoints, and everything else, are at this website, which is different than the website that Build has created for this conference. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that. One of the things that we've also built into this session is an appreciation for how different adult learners are. And the next slide is one of the best ways I've ever found to illustrate that. So what you'll see is that we believe that as we go through this content, there are some learners who really are going to be interested in, give me one resource. I just want a sip of water that will help me really get started on this topic, that I can use as a point of launch into this set of practices. Others of you are the kind of learners who say, don't go through the materials for me. I want to see every resource, and I'll make decisions myself about what I want to access and how I will use that. So please know that if you are a sipper, one of the things that you may want to do is pay less attention when other resources are mentioned, if you feel like you have what you want. And if you are a fire hydrant person, know that everything that we're talking about and more is posted on your website. So I just wanted to make sure that all of you knew that we've structured this in a way that hopefully will meet as many needs as possible. The agenda for today is organized in 3 sections. And the first section, as you'll see on the next slide, has to do with why we need to be more explicit and intentional in our work as part of higher education and professional development. And that probably is a good point for me to also mention one other thing. Based on the title and description of this session, we've organized it so that the ideas we'll be sharing, the messages that we'll be conveying, and the resources we'll be using are targeted to higher education faculty and instructors, people who are in the professional development field, and those may be coaches, mentors, professional development providers, and individuals with statewide responsibility for professional development, possibly as part of QRIS systems, as part of state structures. I recognized the name of a colleague who is a leader in Georgia's system, for example. So one of the things I also want to be sure to say is that this is not a session in which we will be focusing on how to build opportunities for equity at a classroom level. It is not targeted to what teachers working directly with children and families need to do, but instead these are ideas for faculty, instructors, professional development providers, and professional development systems personnel. So please know that we will not be offended if you decide that you don't want to stay and instead might like to check back in and see the resources later. But we want to make sure that you're not frustrated by the lack of messaging around how to work directly with children and families. Second thing that we'll focus on is, what do we know about being explicit? And then finally, we're going to take a look at how we can be explicit in pre-service and ongoing professional development work. a starting point, as you'll see on the next slide, is why is it that we need to really be more explicit? And some of you may be familiar, and at this point, for those of you who are following along on your handout, you'll notice that there's a blue banner that says, why do we need to be more explicit? And then each of the resources that I'll be mentioning is there. Again, many of you are familiar with all of these. For those of you who are not familiar with a particular resource, this may mean that you want to go back and learn more about it later. But I just wanted to make sure that we all appreciated how many new forms of guidance, of evidence, of influence are part of our profession. Simon Sinek has a terrific TED Talk. If you haven't seen his TED Talk on Start With Why, it might be a really transformative thing to do, because part of what he underscores is that we all know what we do, but often really getting clear about why we do that. Why do we teach this course in this way? Why do we support early childhood educators to implement this process? I think he's really great about helping us think about it. On this slide, you see a number of the whys. Whys include the work that was revealed through transforming the workforce, the recent shifts that have been supported through Power to the Profession. Part of that is the revised standards and competencies for early childhood professionals. And then I think other examples of why we really need to think about different approaches and expectations for instruction and professional development is because of a growing body of evidence that the individual biases of early childhood educators are one of the main maintaining factors for racial inequities. We need to differently prepare early childhood educators, and to do that, those of us who are involved in this work need different resources. We also need a lot of work on ourselves to make sure we're doing things as thoughtfully as possible. So what you'll see on the next slide is an example of what happens when a program, and in this case, that program is Durham Technical Community College. What happens when a program really undertakes to be more explicit about why they do what they do in their preparation of future early childhood professionals. And to tell this story, I'm going to ask Cathy and Marye to chime in. And I think, Marye, actually, you're going next. Is that correct?
I think I'm up. What made this real world application about the graduate of the future was first facilitated in our thought process through Script NC. And our foundation really began with this work with our community partners, Durham Head Start, Durham Partnership for Children, North Carolina Central University, Child Care Services Association, our Durham Tech graduates, Child Care Center administrators, our full-time faculty and adjuncts, and our Durham Tech representative and our administration. We all came together and we had a reflective process where we thought about what do we want our graduates to learn upon completion of their early childhood associate degree. And so as we look at the different elements of what makes a quality teacher, we have the mover and shaker list that's here, advocates all the way to being a mentor, leadership, a critical thinker, being accountable, to a lifelong learner, their ability to be able to self-reflect and have a good understanding of who they are as a teacher in our community and serving our children and families there. And so you'll see the next column, which was positive qualities. And this is where we all came together, our community partners, along with our full-time faculty and staff, and with the facilitation of Script NC. And we said, hey, let's look at all of these positive qualities that teachers bring to the table and let's try to maximize what we actually want the teacher to have obtained in our capstone course, EDU 284, and then beyond. And it was exceptional responses that we received from our community partners that said, hey, these are remarkable things that we want them to learn, being open-minded. One that I truly love is smiling, you know, being cheerful and working with integrity and having passion, empathy, takes time to learn and change. And so in that process is also patience. And I like the figure there that has the heart. The heart of the teacher is those qualities that have been outlined in this Graduate of the Future. And so I'm going to pass it on to Cathy, because most of the students in the capstone course, there were several assignments that were aligned, and community partners were right there with us, holding our hands, saying these are the things that we really would like for them to learn. And I'm sure Cathy can share some experiences there with what students grasp.
Yeah, and actually, Cathy, I'm going to ask that you hold those thoughts about 284, because the next thing on the next slide that I actually wanted to have you talk about is something that's directly relevant to this session. So for everyone who's listening, what Marye has just described is a process that's used to really help a higher ed program focus on what is it that we are doing and what is it that we might do differently to really make sure that our graduates know and are able to do what's necessary to support each and every child and family. And what then has happened over the course of the last year is a sequence of work to transform their program to make sure that that's what their graduates are in fact prepared to do. So this process of identifying the graduate of the future can be a really good way to engage colleagues and allies and different partners in getting clear about what they want to achieve. It's a process that's been used at a community level when there is, for example, in a key program, a change in leadership. One of the ways that you can use the same activity is to engage families and community partners to say, what do we need the leader of our program to know and be able to do, to know about this community, to know about race and racism, to know about equity. So the Graduate of the Future activity, which is very clearly spelled out in a document on your website called the Blueprint, can be a great way for a group of people to get clear about why do we need to do things differently and what might that look like. And it's been the other way in which this has been used in programs is to also identify for graduates of this program, one of the things they're being asked to do is to say, do you feel confident and capable in these areas? And Cathy and Marye will tell us more about that in a moment. But more to the point of today's presentation, I want to show you the next slide. So part of what is happening at Durham Technical Community College is that there is a set of indicators that are being used to examine every single course. Indicators that include engaging and building respectful partnerships and communicating effectively with families. One of the, actually, well, let me stop. Cathy or Marye, would you share the change, the indicator that you recently added to this this set of indicators that you're using to revise every single course?
Sure. So if you look under on the required indicators, the blue or the gray shaded box on this document, you'll see the very last one says race and racism. We just added that within the past month after some conversations that we started having amongst ourselves, amongst the faculty of the early childhood program. We have a very engaged group of ladies who are teaching at Durham Tech. Marye and I are the only full-time faculty at Durham Tech. And the rest of our faculty are all part-time or adjunct instructors who have full-time jobs outside of the work that they do with us, but who are so heavily invested in the work we're doing with script, but in all of the work that we do to really support our students to be the best early childhood professionals that they can be, that actually one of our part-time instructors started this conversation. She called me up and she said, Cathy, what are we doing about race and racism in our early childhood coursework? And I said, I don't know, that's a very good question. What are we doing? And so that has led to a bigger conversation of how we are going to be really explicit in including the conversation of race, racism, but then also how do we empower our teachers to be anti-racist and to really use strategies that are helping them recognize their own bias, but then also how to really create an anti-bias curriculum and breathe that work in everything that they do. So right now we're in the midst of working on the EDU 280 course that you see in front of you. And after we added that indicator about a month ago, we've totally revamped 280. The course, the student learning outcomes have been thrown to the wayside and we have completely revamped those. Now that we have this new indicator, the course outline is being totally revamped as well. And so it's really exciting. I sent an email earlier in the week that said, I'm overwhelmed by this work, but I'm very excited by this work. And the beauty of this tool and of the work that we're doing with Camille is that we are very purposeful in this work, and it's a very logical process that makes it be less overwhelming.
Thanks, Cathy. So imagine, I mean, have you ever seen a resource that can enable faculty to look at every course that they either are creating or are considering revisions to, and to hold themselves accountable for indicators that measure, and measures a word that's going to come up again, measure that as an outcome of the course. More on that measurement portion in a minute. I want to move on to a little bit about the what and the importance of being explicit, the importance of definitions. And the next slide really reminds us of some of the frameworks and definitions that are helping us to really shape the field. For those of you who are following along on the handout, we are now sort of at the bottom of page 1. Definitions are tremendously important, and one of the things that we talk a lot about in this work is I frequently see and interact with faculty who say, you know, we absolutely bring an equity lens to our teaching. And when I explore, tell me what you mean by that, it means everybody gets treated the same. And we just tell our students all children should be treated well. And that's not enough, I think, particularly in the current context. So what I'd like to do next is to look at how important it is to be clear in defining our terms. And you see several here. Again, those that I have here on the slide relate to information that's also on your handout. So if any of the frameworks I mention are not familiar, this is a great chance for you to know where to find them. If we look at the next slide, this is one of my favorite examples of why it's so important to be clear about our terms and our definitions. So what you see on the screen right now is snips from 2 resources. The resource on the left is part of the definition of inclusion, of early childhood inclusion, from the joint position statement of the Division for Early Childhood and the National Association for the Education of Young Children. And what I love about this is it just talks about the desired results of inclusive experiences for children with and without disabilities, and really underscores the fact that within that definition of inclusion, if we are not supporting a child, we're doing inclusion wrong. If we are only supporting that child, we're also doing inclusion wrong. So it really underscores that this is for all children. Then, one of the most gorgeous resources to appear in 2019 is the resource on the right. And you'll see the same resource at the bottom of page 1 of your handout. This resource is called Delivering on the Promise of Effective Early Childhood Education. And the subtitle is eliminating exclusionary discipline and concentrating on inclusion. And Iruka and James have created a phenomenal document. For those of you who really are looking at how to get more explicit about the evidence and about practices that support young African American children, this is one of the best resources you can possibly select. However, when I got this, I looked at the word inclusion and I immediately opened the document and keyword searched it to see where the emphasis on children with disabilities was, because that was the lens I was using on inclusion. It's not there. And it's not that either is right or either is wrong. But what this means is, as we think about how to really use inclusive and equitable practices that support each and every child, we need to be clear about what we mean and to make sure that that is part of the work that we're doing. If you have not yet explored this resource on the right, please take a look. It's a marvel. So here's another example. If we look at the next slide, part of what you'll see is a snip from another one of my absolute favorite 2019 publications. This is a publication that's called Culturally Responsive Teaching, and you see it at the top of page 2 of your handout for those of you who are not familiar with this. And the vision of what can be achieved through culturally responsive teaching, of asset-based approaches as alternatives to popular deficit-oriented teaching methods, which position the languages, cultures, and identities of students as barriers to learning. I mean, it's glorious language. And part of what this document also provides is a set of 8 competencies for implementing culturally responsive teaching, along with solid evidence for what the benefits for children are when we use these responsive teaching practices, and the hazards when we don't. The other thing about this particular resource, aside from the fact that it has just fabulous information, is that it also lays out the extent to which these competencies are currently present in state and territory teacher licensure standards. So, for example, the first competency that is identified is the competency of self-knowledge, of self-awareness of our own biases, our own inequities, and how we examine that lens and bring that lens to the work that we do. What the author identified is that of all of the state and territory sets of teacher licensure standards, only 28 of them have self-reflection or self-examination as a component of teacher licensure. So there's lots to be done. For those of you who are more in state systems and ongoing professional development, so one of the things that this calls to mind is, how are these competencies already instilled in the programs that you have for preparing coaches, for preparing mentors, for supporting professional development providers? And this just really helps us to think about another lens to bring to this work that is readily available. The next lens is another new one that many of you may already be using. NAEYC has recently issued, as you'll see on the next slide, a position on equity. And part of what you may or may not be aware of is that this position statement came out. It was approved by the NAEYC Governing Board in June of last year. And then we didn't see it for a while. And we didn't see it for a while for really good reasons. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see what those reasons are. Because above and beyond sending out a new position statement, we've all seen position statements. Position statements come out and we file them. And NAEYC was committed to all the work that went into this equity position statement, informing the work we do in every aspect of the early childhood field. So they created what I call a landing pad. And if you go to the URL on your handout, one of the things that you'll see is the page that looks like this. When you go to this page, not only will you find the position statement, but also you'll find many tools for using the position statement and the equity content in your work. So there is a set of recommendations for administrators. There's a set of recommendations for people who are faculty and professional development providers, any of which can be turned into a self-reflection tool or a tool for examining the quality of the work that we're doing. There also are examples of how equity connects with child development. So there are tremendous resources on this website that you may find useful in the work that you do. The last definition, the final definition that's on your handout and that you see on the next slide, is one that is more important than ever. And I use this definition frequently in the work that I do and encourage you to do the same, because one of the things that we are paying more and more attention to as we build the capabilities of those who support young children and their families is that it's no longer enough to really focus on knowledge acquisition, but that we also truly, as part of higher ed, as part of ongoing professional development, as part of coaching and mentoring, as part of continuous quality improvement, need to focus on knowledge application and how can we document that that application is happening. One of the resources that you may find useful in considering some of these ideas is the next thing that's listed after that definition on your handout. It's called the blueprint process. If what you're interested in is the process that Cathy and Marye alluded to and we'll be talking more about in just a moment, and you want ideas of how to apply that process to work that you're doing, whether it's creating a presentation, evaluating and possibly enhancing a course, the blueprint will give you ideas about how to do that. So let's take a look. The next slide actually shows you the image of the blueprint process. And as I mentioned, that is posted on your website. You can always get to this information. Again, we've already posted everything we're using. But now I'd like to really turn it back to Cathy and Marye. And as Marye was mentioning, one of the courses that was a major overhaul at Durham Tech was their capstone practicum course. And this is one in which they looked very, very carefully at those indicators that we mentioned previously and how to really organize the course differently. So with the next slide, I'm going to turn it back over to my Durham Tech colleagues.
Great, thank you. So the blueprint process, I will encourage you all to pull up that document and to look at it. It's multiple pages, but it really gives you a good overview of how we are deconstructing and then reconstructing our courses. So EDU 284, it's called our capstone practicum course. It's sort of like student teaching at the community college level. It is the last course that our students take in their associate's degree program. In the past, 284 has been students would implement lesson plans, they would observe children, we would check all the boxes and say, there you go, you're ready to be an early childhood professional. But upon closer examination of going through this, this deconstruction process, we really discovered there were some holes. There were things that our graduates were not able to do. We had never even considered how to approach some of those holes until we started doing this process. So if we back up a little bit to the Graduate of the Future exercise that we did with our community partners, we did that sitting in our classroom all around a big table. It was a little bit of an overwhelming process for me, but it was so rewarding because we got to really hear, we want your students to be able to do this when they come into my place of work or when I interact with them. And so we took all of that information to then start looking at 284. What's the context of 284? What are we really hoping that our students leave the course, but then also leave the program able to do? We looked at what is the gist of this course? How are we really going to be able to reconstruct the course to have the outcomes that we're looking for? In North Carolina, we have a common set of course descriptions across all community colleges. So what that means is that every community college has one course description for EDU 284. We can't alter that. What we can do, though, is look at the student learning outcomes and make those unique to our school. So part of the deconstruction process, going through what's the context, what's the gist, what do we really want our students to be able to know and do, we go through that process looking at the course description, but then rewriting those student learning outcomes. A big part of that is we're looking also at the rubric indicator that you'll see on this document that's on the screen. What are the indicators that we are going to explicitly address throughout the course? So what this document on the screen is showing you, before we went through the deconstruction process, you'll see a lot of things were not explicitly demonstrated. Students were not explicitly walking away with the ability or the knowledge of those indicators. Once we went through the revision process, you'll see that almost every one of those boxes are now checked, which is very exciting. The process for 284 took a while. I don't recall how many months it took, but it took a while. And it took a lot of conversation amongst faculty. Our community stakeholders were involved in this conversation. Our script team of really what do we need to include. Let's see, Mary, did you want to jump in and add anything?
You're describing it quite well.
Okay, good.
Yes, yes.
So you'll see on this document, you'll see that we are really looking at a lot of things. We've really embedded many things into this course. You'll see on that far right-hand column some of the assignments in the course. So we have a family engagement plan, the NC Feld Lab. So NC Feld, that stands for the North Carolina Foundations for Early Learning and Development. Those are our early learning professional development standards, or foundations, as we might say as we're going through this. There's an e-portfolio. We are an AC accredited program, so we have a big key assessment in 284 that revolves observations and lesson planning and assessment of young children. So all of this, we completely revised throughout this deconstruction process. And I think on the next slide, Camille, is it the equity? Okay.
Yes.
So if we could go to the next slide. So here is one of the revised, well, not revised, this is one of the brand new assignments. Equity was not something we had talked about before in EDU 284. Prior to this spring semester, it was not a conversation we ever had. But with Camille's encouragement, this assignment was born. Based on the NAUIC position statement on equity, we really looked to see how we could get our students to just read the position statement, but then also how to make connections to their real lives. And so the first wave of doing this in the fall semester, I was trying it out with the students. And so in the fall semester, the beginning of this assignment was take one chunk of the position statement and describe, A, do you understand that? And then how are you currently doing this? Or how might you do this in your work with children? And then what are some resources you need to be able to do that work? So that's how it started. And then it has evolved into this whole reflection tool, which you can see there are, it's a self-evaluation with some components from the position statement. They will reflect on if they agree or disagree, and then to give some follow-up information. And then this evolves into, depending on the course, in the spring semester pre the pandemic, we were a hybrid course and I saw the students in class every other week. After the pandemic, we were a fully online course. So this assignment was originally going to be something that we did in class, where everybody shared face-to-face in class. It evolved to a discussion forum assignment, as well as a deeper conversation one-on-one between myself and the students. So it's a very flexible assignment that you can make work no matter what surprises are thrown your way. The other thing I wanted to just mention, that graduate of the future, so there's an assignment now in 284 about the graduate of the future. The first week of the semester, I show the graduate of the future to the students. I say, and I explain how that came to be. Students are amazed that anyone from the community has come outside and had these conversations. They really were impressed that we have community stakeholders who care about what we're doing at Durham Tech and who care about the outcomes of our students. They were very, very impressed with that. And so then we talked about how the graduate of the future document came to be a thing, and tasked them with, in the beginning of the semester, what are you already doing? Look at this whole list and identify what are you already doing. That they were quickly able to pick out things that they were doing. And then I said, okay, and what are you not doing? And that one, they were surprised to find that they were not doing or not aware of or needed more help in more things than things that they were doing well. Mm-hmm. So the items that they identified of not doing or not really fully understanding, they then had to go do some more research and find out what would be some good resources for them. Who do they need to talk to? What sort of book could they read? How can they figure out to be more proficient in that area that they identified? So the course, at the end of 284, I went from the beginning of 284 being like, okay, I love 284, 284 is great, to the end of 284 going, oh my goodness, this is such a powerful course now. I really feel confident that when our students leave this course and leave Durham Tech, they have a solid foundation in equity. They have a solid foundation in best practices. They have a solid foundation in inclusion. They really are going to be able to demonstrate this knowledge in a meaningful way. The world has changed. We've gone upside down since March, and our fall semester is a little bit up in the air. We are going to have 2 sections of this EDU 284 course in the fall, but it's going to be different because a lot of our students are not going to be able to go to practicum sites. We're going to have a hard time figuring that out. But we're still going to be able to use all of these assignments in meaningful ways. And one way we're going to do that, and I'm going to stop talking because I know Camille's going to talk about this too, is we're going to rely heavily on the personas. So I'm going to turn it back over to Camille.
So let me also, this is where I will freely confess, I created the tool that you're seeing on the screen right now. And I did because it's pulled from the recommendations in the NAEYC position on equity. These are the first 11, there are more. But part of what I really wanted to do is to create an opportunity to reflect on some of those capabilities of truly equitable early childhood educators. I can imagine, and actually, so let me ask you a question before I give you my example. Can you think of other ways that you might use a tool like this? And again, it's posted, it's on page 4 of your handout. But it occurred to me, for example, as a tool that, and if you would share those in the chat box, that would be great. This is a tool that might be used at a regional, state, or systems level in terms of really providing an opportunity for coaches and mentors to reflect on the way that they bring an equity lens to their work. And part of what is interesting about the way I set the tool up is you don't just get to say, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this. It comes instead with the obligation to provide examples, which then might lead to conversations about what are the evidence sources that help you to do that, and other ways to really, again, be clear and explicit. So thanks, Barb, for the example. This is a tool that has many kinds of applications. So In the next section, we hope to answer the pleas for those of you who said we want resources, 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 resources. And as you look at the next slide, you'll see some of the questions that people specifically asked. When I look for resources, I particularly look for things that meet several basic criteria. I need them to be good, which to me means they reflect lenses I prize for diversity, equity, inclusion, and that they also are readily available. I just get frustrated if I need to make more than 2 clicks to get to something, and they need to be free. And so with your understanding, what I will be sharing with you in this next section is lots and lots of free resources. So take it away. Let's look at the next slide. And one of the things that I want to mention first is that at the bottom of page 2 of your handout, you will see a box that looks like this. As part of the work that I do with a number of different states, I've built collections of free, readily available resources around about 20 different topics. There's a collection on each domain of development, and then there are special collections like the ones you see on the screen right now. Each collection is a set of resources that addresses a topic in terms of children from birth through grade 3. Each of these collections has evidence sources, has print sources, has audiovisual sources, has online sources, all of which are free. If you go to the URL that's at the top of this box or this slide, the one that ends in the word toolkit, you will gain access to all 20 collections. The collections that you see here, I have dropped onto your website. So if you are interested in free resources for building the capacity to engage and support families who are diverse in many dimensions, there's a free collection of resources that you'll find on your website. If you're specifically interested in equity resources, the second collection that's listed has lots and lots of examples for you. And one of the things that is new, there is a new collection that you see at the bottom of the page of resources. It is not an exhaustive collection on race and racism. Instead, it's a collection of resources for talking with adults and young children about race and racism. It's about 2 pages, just a really nice assortment of ways to begin and continue thoughtful conversations. So these are just 6 of the collections that related specifically to today's presentation content that I've posted on your website. And if you want to get access to all of the other collections, go to the URL that's on your handout or on this slide, and you can find them. So another way of thinking about how to support inclusion, diversity, and equity begins on the next slide. And so if you take a look at what you see on this next page, you'll meet the first of 3 different tools that have been created to really help be explicit and intentional in our work. So this is an example of a syllabus rubric. It's something that might be used by a faculty member or an instructor who's really interested in looking at the way in which the content of their course addresses specific indicators like an emphasis on supporting young children who are dual language learners, or on supporting young children who are racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse, or on building resilience for children who've experienced trauma. And part of what's particularly useful about this syllabus rubric is it allows you to look at not only is that content in the course that you're teaching or you're designing, where is it in that course? Because earlier we talked about the definition of professional development and how much we really need to shift to emphasis on knowledge application. Can we create those harder to grade assignments that help students show us that they actually can apply what they've learned? So with a tool like this, what it allows you to see is, yes, sure, I address children who are dual language learners. It's in the title, it's in the student learning outcomes, it's a chapter in the text, but I don't really have an assignment that addresses that. And so with a tool like this, it allows you to really look at how the things that you treasure, how those indicators are reflected across the components of a course. If you're brave, I encourage you to partner with another colleague and do this for each other's courses, because often when we think about our own course, we think, well, you know, I always mention equity somewhere in the semester, so I'll give myself credit for that. And I think one of the things that we're learning increasingly is the language you use, the words we use. We are building a professional vocabulary for our students. And part of what we're also doing is helping them understand how to connect to resources, human resources, programmatic resources, evidence resources that can make them lifelong evolving quality professionals. The next slide shows you another tool that I made up. I freely confess, this is something I made up because one of the things that in the work that I do, I was frequently discovering is that there were lots and lots and lots of great student learning outcomes or objectives for a course, but that didn't necessarily translate to how the assignments addressed those. So the initial purpose of this tool was just to say, you know, if you look at the objectives across the top and you look at the assignments down the left-hand column, what's the match? Is there an objective that has nothing measuring it? Then the other components of this tool are, to what extent is each of these assignments a knowledge acquisition assignment, and to what extent are these knowledge application assignments? And one of the things to always keep in mind about that is we almost always, if we have a knowledge application assignment, if students are have read about quality learning centers, and what they are doing is now, as part of an assignment, creating a learning center and taking into account how to really make it an opportunity for equitable learning for particular children. You never want them to make that up. So we always need to provide knowledge acquisition or access to the content and the sources before we require knowledge application. Then the other dimension of this tool is looking at areas of specific emphasis. So this is a chance to see how many of our assignments, if any, address race, address ethnicity, address resilience, address dual language learners. So these are tools that have been created for work with higher ed, but take a look at the next slide and see what you think about this. This is a tool for those of us who provide ongoing professional development or are designing a sequence of professional development. Just as easily, when we think about the content that we want to convey, we think about that content in chunks. What is it about family engagement that we really want participants to know and be able to do? So thinking about the objectives for a presentation, for a webinar, for a professional development series, that same approach can be used to intentionally designing for these features to be included. And I often hear professional development providers say, you just can't build knowledge application into a short presentation. In just a minute, I'll challenge that thought and we can see what you think about that. So These tools are part of your handout, so anyone who finds them useful, and you can create columns that work for you. There's a version of this that has the NAUAC standards and competencies. So along with looking at assignments through the lenses that are here, you can also look at how they align with a set of standards, or you could look at how they align with another document, perhaps your state's core knowledge and core competencies or something like that. Now, on the next slide, I will introduce you to the wonderful world of personas. And again, this is just something I made up. So this is a brand new persona. This happens to be Joseph. And so take a minute and just read a little bit about Joseph. And while you're reading about Joseph, Cathy and Marye, would you share a little bit about how personas are used in the Durham Tech program?
Marye, do you want to start us off by talking about what happened in March in our key assessments and how personas were used in child, family, and community courts?
Oh, absolutely. So what the personas provided for our students, in particular, I'm thinking about our EDU 131 course. This allows students to go out into the community and make relationships, or at least build relationships with families and children in different centers. And so there was that opportunity to do that. And so, of course, students were very concerned, highly concerned, like, how am I going to complete this assignment without going to do an observation physically and get the work done? And so what the personas provided was really good insight on a child's family composition, their abilities, and it challenged teachers to look at how you will actually work with this child, but not only the child, but the family component too, because a lot of teachers sometimes can stay focused in on just what am I going to do for the child in my classroom at this particular time, but it stretches the teacher to kind of focus more also on the families and to reach out to families to get the full information that they need. And so the personas were current. There were situations that a lot of teachers identified with, like I've seen this happen before. A lot of the feedback was it provided reflective time for me to think about what I shall do. And even to some mistakes in terms of I didn't know that this is what I should do in a particular situation. And so the resources that were provided within those personas gave teachers the opportunities to, again, just research and be more intentional about their teaching with children based on those personas. And I'm going to step back and just say, I enjoy the personas as well, because it gave me an opportunity to push my thought process on different abilities that children have, inclusion, all the way to race and culture and ethnicity. And because I want to be as authentic as I can to my students, right? So I want to make sure that I'm able to look at those personas in a reflective manner too.
So I'm noticing that a colleague has asked about, yes, she heard me say that I've created the personas. I've created different sets at different times. This is Camille, and when I do that, there is always a bastion reading behind me. And the people who read behind me to make sure that I have not inadvertently reinforced a stereotype or done anything that is contrary to local customer tradition, is to have both professionals and families read behind me. And as a matter of fact, there's a state that I will soon be creating a set of personas for. And we have both groups already organized so that that vetting process will also include faculty members. So people who are daily in the field and know what the challenges are and what some of the points are that are hard around which to prepare professionals, but also families who can say, you know, I just don't like that in this particular family, it's a single Black mother, because I think that just might reinforce that stereotype. So that's the process. It's not, it hasn't been formalized, but that was a great question. So now you've had a chance to just take a look at Joseph. And again, as I created these, there is always some information about the family configuration is always different. There is always information about what a child is inspired by, loves, finds easy. And there's also information about what the child may find challenging and who they are as a learner. Some of them have questions like those you see here, and many of them do not, so that you can use them really flexibly. But let's take a look at the next slide, and I'd ask you to think about, so what if, as Cathy and Marye are, you were designing or redesigning your course on language and literacy, and you really wanted to make sure you had made the commitment, as you heard earlier, to really bringing an equity lens. So some of the kinds of information that you may want to draw on, and kind of, you know, run in your minds the parallel process. What if you at a state level are responsible for doing a sequence of professional development on literacy? So some of the things that we're taking a look at is what evidence do we have about approaches that really can make literacy more equitable for each child. And this happens to be information from a study that was done at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute about a particular approach to literacy development that's great for all children, but particularly effective for African American children. And these are the kinds of evidence sources that we have the opportunity to connect with a persona like Joseph to say, you know, what can we identify as information? What I also need to tell you is, as part of thinking about how to revise this course, some of the amazing insights I've had is I've been able to hear the mother of a 3-year-old African-American boy talk about the difference it makes when he's looking at books that have children who look like him. I got to hear the grandmother of a child really read through a storybook and talk about all the different configurations of families there are. And her friend Jessica has 2 moms just like this. These are part of how we really bring an equity lens to our work, and it just there's a lot that we can be doing. And Crystal, thank you for sharing that. I continue to learn a lot. I have to say that one of the distinctions that to me is tremendously important is I make a distinction between research-based and evidence-based. And research-based to me is, that there's solid research that probably has been published. Evidence-based to me incorporates the best available research, but also takes into account the community, also takes into account family perspectives, because if the families of children in a classroom are saying, I don't care what your article says, that's not what works for my son, we need to really figure out how to put that all together. And so that's just another important feature of what we need to be aware of. The next slide will show you a different persona. In this case, you're going to meet Jake. Jake's a little guy who is 4.5 and has never been with other children, has not had any of those kinds of experiences that we might think of as readiness experiences. Jake is now in a program where his fine motor skills are not on a par with his classmates, because he's never cut scissors, never held crayons, never turned the pages of a book. And he's also really frustrated because he's not been with other kids. And so Jake is an example of a different kind of persona, if you look at the next slide, part of what you'll see is how, whether it's in a college course or in a workshop, you can use a persona like Jake to incorporate more explicit and intentional content. So, you know, let's say that you were doing a workshop on fine motor skill development, and you started with your state early learning guidelines, and you had participants come up with 3 small group activities that would build fine motor skills. And because you're really, you know, conscious of the natural world, you are using only naturally occurring materials. If part of what you did was to bring Jake and Jake's story to that presentation, what it would allow you to do is to really build in a different emphasis, and to say, you know, with Jake in mind, how might you design activities that would support both fine motor and social emotional development, using what you know about Jake as a learner and the things he loves. So these become ways to really support the skill for individualizing. The next persona is a different kind of example. This is Montgomery. And what you'll discover about Montgomery when you see him is that he's a little guy who is in 3rd grade. And his is a family that when it comes time to make a decision, everybody just, you know, they collect all the best possible ideas, and sometimes all at once, sometimes talking all over each other, but their idea of how you solve problems, how you make decisions, is through collective wisdom. And so Monty is now a 3rd grader, and every time he gets an assignment for independent work, the first thing he does is turn to the child next to him and say, what do you think? How should we do this? And he is constantly in trouble for being disruptive, for not doing his own work, when teachers even called him a cheater. This is an aspect of who this child is as a learner. And so part of what bringing Montgomery in as a persona might help us to think about, if you look at the next slide, is how, instead of just thinking about, and you'll see this makeover in just a second, how in terms of thinking about, for example, science activities that you would do with 3rd graders. So as you think about 3rd graders and what they're interested in, designing activities, what if Montgomery were one of the children that you were asked to think about, who's part of the class that you're designing those activities for? And one of the expectations is, based on this child, what would be a more equitable way to create opportunities for him to be a successful learner? So how could those science activities feature collaborative decision making? And so these are just a couple personas. These are examples of how you might use them in any professional development, coaching, mentoring, teaching situation, to really bring the lens of inclusion, bring the lens of a dual language learner, bring a different lens to promote both thinking about what we know about how to effectively support each child and each family, and incorporating that into the conversation. On your website, there are collections, 3 collections of personas. One of them is infant toddler personas, one is preschool age personas, and one is early elementary personas. Some of them are children with disabilities, some of them are children with really diverse life circumstances. They're available for you. But if you really want to get creative, the next slide will allow us to introduce the work of our colleague whom we mentioned earlier. So one of the things that Flo Thompson does as part of her teaching, and we also have already thought about how this could be part of ongoing professional development, is to ask students to create personas. And as you'll see on the next slide, with one particular class that she teaches, the students are divided into groups, each of which takes a particular age. So there's an infant class, infant toddler class, a preschool class. And part of what each of the students do is they endow their child with characteristics. And so, you know, Flo uses the indicators as part of those characteristics. And what it allows her students to do is to both invest deeply in a particular child, but also to really take into consideration as part of every assignment how things might work for the other children in that class. And on your website is the set of resources. The next page has a couple other examples that you'll see of the personas. We already are talking in a number of programs about how to, you know, some of you may remember your high school class pictures, how we can still have students online create their children and then, you know, electronically to create the class, so that students could always be thinking about whenever they consider a point of view, it's not how, you know, how will this work generally, it's how will we make sure that what we're doing is equitable and it will work for each and every child. So any family personas, good question. Each of the personas clearly lays out components of the family, including configurations, you know, just whether this is a family of recent immigrants, whether there have been different life circumstances. So take a look and see, but I think the idea of family personas are wonderful, but I think we always need to make sure that in addition to identifying the things that might be unique or challenging for each learner, we also need to think of the things that they love and are good at, and how we can always be building a strengths-based approach. So let's slide into, we're nearing the end of our time together. I want to mention a couple more things as we go to this next slide, and we're now down on the bottom half of page 3 of your handout, 2 of your handout, excuse me, please. So as we think about frameworks that can help to support the connection between equity, inclusion, and diversity, and the work we do at all levels, including at systems levels, there are wonderful tools in place that really remind us of what we need to strive for in terms of more equitable policies and practices. I think that those are great to build from, but what I'd like to offer is, I think, a new approach that is particularly inspiring and promising, as you'll see on the next slide. I think one of the challenges that we run into is that we end up with 14 frameworks or 14 lenses, and we need to look through the equity lens, and we need to look through the state standards lens, and we need to look through this lens, and we need to look through that lens. And it's crazy making because we're always adding new lenses. This is an example. The Pyramid Model Equity Coaching Guide is an example of how those things can fit together. Because, you know, one of the things that's always intrigued me is that often when coaches or mentors as part of a state professional development system would come into a classroom, often they were looking for particular characteristics or particular progress. And I always wanted to say, while you're there, could you also pay attention to these other things? This is, I think, a really nice example of what that can look like, because this is a tool that kind of meshes a lens for equity with the lens for the pyramid practices for social and emotional development. And if you look at it, it has wonderful examples of, I mean, so just like we were looking at Jake and how do we support both fine motor and social emotional, this tool has examples of how we support or how we look simultaneously at pyramid model practices and equity. And so these are the kinds of tools that I think we need to be developing, things that cross frameworks and enable us to bring multiple lenses and the evidence-based practices from multiple bodies of research. I think we're getting more and more information about how to support racially diverse children. I think, and many of those practices will support each and every child. But I think we need both. What are the universal practices and what are the unique practices? So we always can go to both. In closing, or in starting to get ready to close, the next slide reminded me of a kind of an interesting perspective that I want to bring to you briefly. In January of 2011, Ioma Aruka and Allison DeMarco wrote a paper that was called Quality Rating and Improvement Systems, a Social Equity Strategy. And it included recommendations for how a quality rating and improvement system might be the vehicle for achieving equity. And I think I hunted for a copy online. I'm sorry to say I couldn't find one, or I would have posted it for you. But I think that we are at a point where we can do a better and better job of clearly incorporating an equity lens everything we do. And I think part of that, I just 3 thoughts on that. One is I think we have to really measure what we treasure and treasure what we measure. So, you know, if ours is a college course or a state quality improvement system that is committed to equity, is included to eliminating racism, then we can't bury that language in the preamble. That it has to be part of what programs are attending to every day. It has to be a feature of the continuous quality improvement work. And I think measuring that in ways that are meaningful is tremendously important in any aspect of this work. I think, you know, we also measure that by really making the commitment to disaggregate data and be able to show, are we doing well for each and every child? And if not, what do we need to do better and differently? And then I think being explicit and intentional has been the theme in some ways of this session, that we need to be clear about why we do things. We need to define our terms. We need to be able to identify the evidence-based practices that underlie what we're doing. And we need to be prepared to make our good work even better by being more explicit and intentional. And I think the final message along these lines is that osmosis is not an effective strategy for promoting and achieving change. If you're hoping that because there have been lots of articles published recently, that that's going to make people more aware of how to bring a racial equity lens to their work, osmosis is just not something to invest in. We really need effective sequences of professional development. And hopefully this session has provided you with some thoughts on how that might happen. So let's move now to just some final resources that may be places for you to just get some more information. So on your handout, one of the things I wanted to do, if you're not already familiar with the Script NC website, so I want to make you familiar with it. It's organized in 4 chunks. The first chunk is course-specific materials. What that is 12 different content chunks of frequently taught course content, but it doesn't mean you can't go there if you are doing a presentation on infants and toddlers and find resources. It is, has a strong underpinning related to culture, race, equity, inclusion, and diversity. So it has a searchable database. You can find all kinds of free resources there. The other thing that I also want to let you know is that this is a project that does free webinars for faculty and professional development providers. All of our webinars are free, and all of the resources from them are archived. So you'll find resources online, but I want to make you aware of a webinar that's coming up on the next slide, because it is a session specifically focused on how to bring a universal design for learning lens to how we think about adult learners. So as we consider all of the learners who are involved as students in college courses as coaching partners, as participants in professional development, part of what we know is that they may be English language learners, they may be individuals for whom literacy and math may be difficult, that they, just like children, have many different components to who they are as learners, particularly as we move to an online system of delivery. So the very talented Paul Luelmo will be doing a free webinar, and I wanted to make sure that you knew about that webinar and had the opportunity to sign up for that should you wish to. So you just need to go to the Script NC website and you will find that information. Finally, a new resource, and I know I've shared this with Marye and Cathy, the Anti-Defamation League has recently started, if you go back a slide, very quickly, has recently started a free, one more slide back, has recently started a free distribution list called Connect 3, which has fabulous resources for supporting issues of bias, of diversity, of equity. You have information about it on your handout. And with that, I need to thank my colleagues for doing such a phenomenal job of sharing resources and ideas, and see what y'all think before we move on to closing. So this would be a time at which we would love to hear if there are any thoughts about possibly where to go next. Is this content you would like more about? Do you want content that would specifically focus on higher ed, on ongoing professional development? What worked, what didn't? And I think you'll also be asked this as part of the evaluation, but any of those comments that you would care to share, we would love to see at this time. Once again, all of the materials from this handout are posted at the website that I have referred to as your website. Once again, I'll put that URL right here. So the PowerPoints are there if you wish to use those, all of the handouts, all of the personas. And thanks, Lillian, that's a great suggestion. You have our email addresses, and we'd also love to hear more from you if you have any feedback or any thoughts about what might be helpful next. And with that, I'm going to say, Cathy and Marye, any more thoughts on your parts?
I don't think so. Thank you so much for this. If you all haven't discovered this, or if you didn't know this before, Camille is the resource person. If there's a resource that you need to have, Camille knows about it. So I would really encourage you to go to your website, to go to the Script NC website and just learn from all of her knowledge.
Thanks, Cathy. All right, Debbie, we're back to you.
All right. Well, I just want to say before you sign off, we encourage you to give us some feedback on today's session. Some poll questions are popping up on your screen. Let us know in the chat box what was useful, significant, or new, and how we can improve the sessions moving forward. I'd sincerely like to thank our session leaders today for this interesting and informative opportunity. We appreciated the contributions from all the participants in the chat box and the plethora of resources and how to apply them that you all shared today. It was just, I think that next step is where we're going in our conversations, and you just gave us some beautiful examples of application and, of course, so many resources to use. Thanks to everyone for joining in today, and hope to see you all again soon. Keep going on the evaluation.
Yeah, this is fun for us to watch.
And if you have suggestions, please throw them right into the chat box that the questions aren't getting at, because we do take that feedback seriously, and take a careful look, and as the session leaders do as well. Well, it's Friday. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you in some of the sessions in the future. And if you weren't able to get into a session, remember that they'll all be posted on our website and available to you in the future.